The locket hit the floor of the sheriff's office with a sound like a gunshot, and every man in the room went still. Marshal Ethan Aldridge stood in the doorway, trail dust on his coat and 3 days of stubble on his jaw, his dark eyes fixed on the woman sitting in the wooden chair across from Deputy Hicks. She had her wrists bound in front of her with rope, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders, and when she looked up and saw what had skittered across the floorboards and stopped at her boot, the color drained completely from her face. "Where did you get that?" she said. It was not a question. Her voice had gone so low and so dangerous that even Deputy Hicks, who had never in his 22 years of life been afraid of a woman, shifted backward in his chair. "Picked it up in Caldwell," Ethan said. He stepped inside and let the door swing shut behind him. Off the body of a man named Douglas Parrish. She was on her feet before anyone could stop her, the chain of the locket catching the lamplight as she snatched it up from the floor, and her bound hands pressed it against her chest so hard that the edge of it must have cut into her skin. But she did not flinch. Her eyes were wet and furious at the same time, and she looked at him like he was something she could not yet decide whether to trust or destroy. "Douglas Parrish is dead," she said. "Yes," Ethan said. "He is." She stared at him across the width of that small, smoky room, and something passed between them that Deputy Hicks could not name but would remember for the rest of his life, as the most charged silence he had ever witnessed. Then her jaw tightened, and she sat back down and she pressed the locket against her sternum and closed her eyes. "How long have you been following me?" she said. Ethan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slowly, like a man setting down something heavy he had been carrying for a long time. "3 counties," he said. "Since Wichita." She opened her eyes then, and she looked at him with an expression that held grief and fury and something older than either, something that lived in the place where a person keeps the things they cannot afford to say out loud. "You tracked me across 3 counties," she said, "to return a locket." "Yes," he said. "That makes no sense," she said. He looked at her steadily. "It does to me." And that was where it truly began, though the story itself had started long before that moment, in a place far from this cramped sheriff's office in the town of Harlan, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882. It had started in Wichita on a Tuesday morning with the smell of rain and the sound of a woman's boots on a wooden platform. Ethan Aldridge had been a United States Marshal for 6 years, operating out of the federal court in Wichita, and in that time he had developed a reputation that preceded him into every town he rode into. He was not the kind of man who was famous for shooting fast, though he could. He was not the kind of man who was known for cruelty, though the job sometimes required a hardness that left marks on a person. He was known, instead, for something that most people in law enforcement considered either his greatest asset or his most dangerous flaw, which was the fact that he finished what he started. He did not let things go. He did not walk away from something unresolved. If he said he would do a thing, it was done, and if he took on a case, it was closed, one way or another. He was 30 years old that autumn. He was not especially tall, but he was broad through the shoulders and unhurried in the way he moved. And his face was the kind of face that a person trusted before they understood why, which was partly useful and partly a burden. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a schoolteacher and a man who repaired clocks, and he had come to Kansas at the age of 23 with a recommendation letter and a very clear sense of what right and wrong looked like, which the years had since complicated considerably, but never entirely erased. He was standing at the telegraph office window in Wichita when he first saw Margaret Alcott, though he did not know her name yet. She was walking fast, which caught his attention because most people in Wichita in October walked slowly, The way people walk when they are not sure where they are going and are not especially eager to arrive. She was not walking like that. She was walking with the particular kind of speed that a person generates when they are trying to leave something behind without looking like they are running. A subtle but unmistakable urgency. And Ethan Aldridge, who had spent 6 years reading people the way other men read maps, noticed it immediately. She was carrying a carpet bag in one hand and had her other arm pressed close to her side, like she was protecting something beneath her coat. She was perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair pinned up under a plain bonnet, and a quality to her features that suggested she had not always worn plain bonnets or plain anything. There was nothing ragged about her, but there was something stripped, like a person who had recently had several layers removed that they had not chosen to remove. He might have simply watched her pass and returned to waiting for his telegraph message, except that 2 men came around the corner of the bank building on the far side of the street 30 seconds after she did, and they were looking in the direction she had gone. They were looking in the specific way that men look when they are searching for a particular person rather than simply looking around. Ethan did not follow her. Not yet. He watched the 2 men and let them move past him, and then he sent his telegraph message and collected the one that had come in for him. And he read it twice on his way back to the federal office. And it was only when he was sitting at his desk that afternoon and going over the list of persons of interest that his colleague, Marshal Donovan, had flagged last month that he found her. Margaret Alcott, age 26, native of St. Louis, Missouri. Wanted for questioning in connection with the robbery of the First Territorial Bank of Wichita, in which $4,000 had been taken on the morning of September the 14th, 1882, by a group of 3 individuals, 2 men and a woman. He read it 3 times. The woman matching the description in the file was described as having dark hair, medium height, and notable composure, in that she had spoken calmly to the bank teller and asked him to step back from the window before the 2 men accompanying her had produced their weapons. Wanted for questioning did not mean wanted for arrest. It meant that someone in the federal office thought she knew something, and Ethan had learned the difference between those 2 categories a long time ago, because the federal office was not always careful about that distinction, and the consequences of blurring it tended to fall on whoever was in the chair being questioned. He had pulled her file and read it 3 more times that evening, and then he had done something he could not entirely explain to himself, which was that he had walked back down to the train platform where he had first seen her and looked at the ground near the station bench where she had briefly stopped. He found the locket there, half hidden beneath the bench where it had apparently fallen, the chain broken. It was a small oval of silver, not particularly expensive but clearly not cheap either, with an engraving on the back that he had to hold close to the lamplight to read. The engraving said in careful script, "For M, who carries what others cannot bear." He had stood there for a long time with that locket in his palm, and then he had put it in his coat pocket and gone home to think. The next morning, he had learned 2 things in quick succession. First, that Margaret Alcott had not been on either of the trains that departed Wichita the previous evening. Second, that the 2 men he had seen searching for her were named Curtis Rhodes and Frank Vey, both of whom were known associates of a man named Douglas Parrish, who ran a loosely organized but consistently profitable outfit of thieves operating between Wichita and Dodge City. Douglas Parrish was not a man that Ethan had a warrant for. He was a man that Ethan had been building a case against for 14 months, carefully and methodically, the way his father had built clocks, piece by piece, never forcing a part into a place it did not belong. And now this woman, this Margaret Alcott, was apparently connected to Parrish in some way, and she was also connected to the bank robbery, and she was somewhere in or near Wichita being hunted by two of Parrish's men. He had told himself, sitting in his office that morning with a cup of cold coffee, that his interest in finding her was professional. He had told himself that she might have information about Parrish that could advance the case. He had told himself that the locket was simply a piece of evidence that might be relevant to the investigation. He had not told himself the truth yet, which was that the engraving on the back of the locket had not left his mind since the moment he had read it, and that the image of her walking fast and frightened through the streets of Wichita, with her arm pressed close to her side, had settled in his chest in a way that had nothing to do with professional obligation. He had requested assignment to the case that afternoon, and within 48 hours, he had ridden south out of Wichita with the locket in his shirt pocket, following a trail that was already 3 days cold. Margaret Alcott had not planned to become a woman who ran. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a physician named William Alcott, who had died of fever when she was 19, leaving her a moderate amount of debt, a house that needed significant repair, and a younger brother named Thomas who was 17 and clever in the way that clever young men often are, which is to say that he was clever enough to get himself into serious trouble, and not quite clever enough to get himself out of it. Thomas had gotten himself tangled up with Douglas Parrish 3 years ago, at the age of 20, when he had ridden out to Kansas looking for work, and found instead a man who was charming and well-spoken, and who had offered him a job that paid well and did not require many questions. Thomas had written her letters that were cheerful and vague, and she had read between the lines of them for a year before she had finally packed a bag and taken the train to Wichita to find out what exactly her brother was doing. What she had found was a 20-year-old boy who was in deep with a man who did not let people leave. She had spent 4 months in Wichita, working as a seamstress and trying to figure out how to extract her brother from a situation that grew more complicated the more she understood it. She had met Parrish herself, twice, at the house where he held meetings, and she had immediately recognized the specific texture of his danger, which was not the kind that announced itself loudly, but the kind that was quiet and absolute and dressed itself in good manners. The bank robbery had not been her choice. She wanted to be very clear about that, at least to herself, in the accounting she kept inside her own mind. She had gone into the bank that morning because Parrish had told Thomas that if Margaret did not assist, there would be consequences for Thomas that he had described in enough detail to make her understand that they were not rhetorical. She had spoken to the teller calmly because panic would have made things worse, not better. She had not touched the money. She had not carried a weapon. She had walked in and she had walked out, and she had felt something inside her shift permanently, like a bone that sets wrong after it breaks. 3 days later, she had taken Thomas to the train station herself, with enough money pressed into his hand to get him to his cousin's farm in Nebraska. And she had told him to stay there and not write her any letters for a while, and she had watched the train pull away with her heart in her throat. And then she had walked back through Wichita and started thinking about how to leave. The problem was Parrish. The problem was that Parrish knew she had helped Thomas leave, and he did not like it when assets, which was the word he used for people, moved without his knowledge. She had heard him use that word once in a conversation she was not supposed to hear, and the coldness of it had told her everything she needed to know about how he thought about other human beings. She had lost the locket at the train station without knowing it. She had been reaching into her bag for her handkerchief when she had seen Rode and Vey coming around the corner of the bank building, and she had simply walked, deliberately and quickly, in the opposite direction, and the chain must have broken when she pulled her hand out of the bag too fast. That locket was the only thing she owned that had belonged to her mother. Her mother, Clara Alcott, had died when Margaret was 12, and she had left Margaret nothing except a small silver locket and the memory of being held by someone who made the world feel safe. Her father had given her the locket 3 years after her mother's death, when he found it in a drawer and wept a little before pressing it into her hands, and she had worn it every day since, and the engraving on the back was something her father had added, because that was the kind of man he had been. She had spent the next week in a panic. She kept carefully hidden on the inside, sleeping in a boarding house 2 streets from the one Parrish knew about, and trying to decide which direction to run and how far was far enough. She had moved south toward Caldwell because Caldwell was a cattle town with a great deal of traffic, and it was easier to be invisible in traffic. And from Caldwell, she had planned to take the Kishom Trail south and then cut east toward Arkansas, where she had a vague and increasingly desperate plan to disappear. She had been in Caldwell for 4 days when Douglas Parrish arrived. She did not see him arrive. She heard about it secondhand, from a woman named Hattie who ran the boarding house where Margaret was staying, and who told her over breakfast one morning that a well-dressed man from up Wichita way had been asking around about a young, dark-haired woman from Missouri, and had mentioned her name specifically. Margaret had been out the back door with her carpet bag before the coffee finished cooling. She had ridden east from Caldwell on a horse she rented from a livery stable, paying more than the horse was worth so that the stable owner would forget her quickly. And she had cut north through the grasslands and ended up in a small settlement called Miller's Crossing, which was in Comanche County and barely deserved to be called a town, and which was the kind of place where a person could sleep in a hayloft and not be remarked upon. It was there, 4 days into her stay, that she had woken up to find Rode and Vay standing in the barn doorway. They had not hurt her. She wanted to be precise about that. They had taken her by the arms and walked her back to Caldwell and handed her to Douglas Parrish, who was staying in the best room at the only hotel in Caldwell, and who had looked at her across his breakfast table with an expression of mild disappointment that was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. He had told her that she was going to assist with one more job because she owed him for the disruption she had caused, and then after that she was free to go wherever she liked, and he said this in a tone that made it sound generous, which it was not. She had looked at the table and thought about her brother on a farm in Nebraska, and thought about her mother's locket that she had lost, and thought about the specific and suffocating sensation of having no good options, and she had said yes. That night, she had taken the pistol from the coat that Rode had left hanging on a chair in the room where she was sleeping, and she had walked across the hotel hallway and opened the door to Parrish's room, and she had pointed the gun at him while he was sleeping, and tried very hard to decide whether she was a person who could do what she was thinking about doing. She had stood there for a long time, long enough for Parrish to wake up and see her and go still. And then she had taken the money he had on the nightstand, which turned out to be $212, and she had taken his horse from the stable because it was faster than anything else available, and she had ridden east through the night and not stopped until she reached a town called Harper, which was in Harper County and was therefore, she had calculated while riding, in a different county entirely from where Parrish was. 3 days later, a marshal named Ethan Aldridge had ridden into Harper. She had spotted him through the window of the dry goods store where she was buying supplies, and she had recognized the badge and the way he moved, and she had felt the specific sick knowledge that comes when a person understands that the thing they were afraid of has arrived. She had done the only thing she could do, which was finish paying for her supplies and walk out of the store and act like she had nowhere to be, and she had been almost 2 blocks away when he had fallen into step beside her. "Margaret Alcott," he had said. She had kept walking. "You have the wrong person." "I don't," he said, and his voice was even and quiet, and there was nothing threatening in it, which was somehow more alarming than a threat would have been, because it suggested he did not need to threaten her. "Are you arresting me?" she said. "I haven't decided yet," he said. She had stopped walking and turned to look at him fully, because that was not the answer she had expected, and she was a person who prided herself on expecting the right things. He was younger than she had assumed from a distance, and there was something in his face that was not the hardness she had expected, not entirely. There was hardness, yes, the kind that comes from years of difficult work in a difficult landscape, but there was also something else, something more careful and considered, and she found herself reassessing him more quickly than she usually reassessed people. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means I'd like to ask you some questions first," he said. She had looked at him for a moment that stretched out a little longer than was comfortable, and then she had said, "All right." They had sat in the back of the Harper Hotel dining room for 2 hours, and he had asked her questions, and she had answered some of them and deflected others. And she had watched him the whole time the way she watched people when she was trying to determine what they wanted and what they were willing to do to get it. He was methodical and direct, and he did not play the games that some men played when they were interrogating someone, the games that were about power rather than information. He seemed to actually want information, which was unusual enough to be slightly disorienting. She had not told him everything. She had told him enough, she thought, to explain the bank robbery in terms that placed her as coerced rather than willing, and she had told him about Parrish in terms that were careful and measured and which she hoped sounded credible, because they were true. She had not told him about the night in the hotel in Caldwell. She had not told him about the gun or the money or the horse. He had listened with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on her face the entire time, and when she finished, he had been quiet for a moment that was long enough to be uncomfortable. "You know I'm going to have to take you in for formal questioning," he said. "I know," she said. "And you know there's a warrant out for your arrest in connection with the robbery," he said. "There is," she said. "That warrant," he said, was signed by a judge who is on retainer to the First Territorial Bank, which is owned in partnership by a man named Douglas Parrish. She had stared at him. "The warrant is designed to bring you back into Parrish's reach," he said, "not into a courtroom." She had continued to stare at him. "Which means that if I take you to Wichita," he said, "I am doing Parrish's work for him, and I have a significant objection to that." "What are you saying?" she said. "I'm saying," he said, and he paused for a moment as if choosing the exact right words was important to him, "that I need to think about how to handle this in a way that serves justice rather than corruption, and I would appreciate if you would not disappear while I'm doing that." She had looked at him for a long time. "You're asking me to trust a marshal," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is a significant request," she said. "I know it is," he said. She had not trusted him, not then. But she had stayed, and that was its own kind of statement. They had spent 3 days in Harper together, while Ethan wrote letters to a federal judge in Topeka, whose name he trusted. And during those 3 days, something had shifted between them in a way that she would not have predicted and could not entirely account for. He was not what she had expected. He was thorough and serious, and he asked her questions that were not about the robbery, questions about what she had wanted before all of this, about her father and her brother, and the life she had been living in St. Louis, and the questions were not intrusive. They were interested, and there was a difference between those two things that she recognized. She had asked him questions too, eventually, because it felt unfair to let the conversation run only one direction. And she had learned that he was from Missouri as well, that his father had been a clockmaker in Jefferson City, that he had come to Kansas, for reasons he described briefly as complicated, and which she understood to mean painful. She had learned that he had a methodical and serious relationship with fairness that was not the kind that people adopt as a convenient principle, but the kind that seemed to be embedded in the actual structure of how he thought. And this was the thing about him that she found most difficult to dismiss or minimize. She had also learned on the second evening, when they had eaten dinner together in the hotel dining room and the conversation had grown easier, that he still had something of hers. "I found it at the Wichita station," he said, setting the locket on the table between them. The chain was broken. She had looked at it and felt the same thing she always felt when she thought about losing it, which was a grief that was disproportionate to the size of the object but entirely proportionate to what it meant. "You tracked me to return it," she said. "Partly," he said. "What's the other part?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "The case," he said, and then after a pause that was slightly too long to be comfortable, "and the questions." She had picked up the locket and held it, and she had looked at the man across the table, and she had felt something shift inside her that she was not ready to examine closely. "The engraving is from my father," she said. "When my mother died, he was the one who kept telling me that I was stronger than I thought, that I could carry the grief, that I carried what others couldn't." Ethan had looked at her with an expression that was very careful and very quiet. "He sounds like a good man," he said. "He was," she said. They had been quiet for a moment, and the dining room was empty around them, and the lamplight was warm and low, and she had thought, sitting there with her mother's locket in her hands, that she could not remember the last time she had been somewhere that felt, even briefly, like something other than a situation she needed to escape. But then Parrish had appeared, and the situation had changed entirely. He had arrived in Harper on the morning of the fourth day with Rode, and Vey, and two other men she did not recognize. She had been standing at the window of her room when she saw them ride in, and she had gone cold all the way through in the specific way that she went cold when real danger arrived as opposed to the theoretical kind. She had not told Ethan. She had taken her carpet bag and her coat and the locket, which she had kept in her pocket since the night at dinner, and she had gone out the back of the hotel and found the livery stable and paid for a horse and ridden east. She was not proud of leaving without telling him. She knew, even as she rode, that it was not the right thing to do, and she knew that it looked like guilt, and she knew that he had been trying to help her. But the specific combination of Douglas Parrish and any lawman of any kind had a bad history in her understanding of how the world worked, and her instinct for self-preservation was stronger than her inclination to do the right thing at that particular moment. She had ridden east and then north, and she had crossed into Barber County and then into Kingman County, and she had been making her way toward Pratt when she had been stopped by Deputy Hicks, who had a report of a woman riding a horse registered to a Harper livery stable, and who had held her in the Harlan sheriff's office for 2 days while he tried to figure out what to do with her. And then Ethan had walked through the door. He had come through the door of that office and looked at her, and she had been ashamed and angry in equal measure. Ashamed because she had run from a man who had been trying to help her, and angry because she was sitting in a chair with her wrists tied and still at the mercy of people and systems and forces that had nothing to do with justice. And then the locket had hit the floor, and he had said 3 counties, and something had rearranged itself between them permanently. Deputy Hicks had left the room within 20 minutes of Ethan arriving, on the grounds that Marshal Aldridge outranked him and had federal authority over the matter, and also on the grounds that the air between the 2 people in his office was so charged that he felt distinctly in the way. Ethan had cut the rope from her wrists with a small pocket knife and put the pieces of rope on the desk and sat back down. "Douglas Parrish came to Harper," she said. The morning of the fourth day, I saw him from my window. I know, he said. I saw him too, about 20 minutes after you left. She looked at her wrists where the rope had left red marks, and then she looked up at him. You followed me anyway, she said. I told you I needed you not to disappear, he said. You also said you were going to help me, she said. And then Parrish showed up, and you are a lawman, and I have had reason to understand that those two things together are not safe for me. I know, he said, and there was no argument in it, only acknowledgement. I understand why you ran. She searched his face for something she could object to and did not find it. What happened with Parrish, she said. In Harper. Something passed across Ethan's face then, something complicated and not entirely settled. Parrish is dead, he said. She went very still. There was a confrontation, he said. Not with me. It turned out that Parrish had been working a game across multiple counties for long enough that a number of people had outstanding grievances against him. And some of those people had arrived in Harper the same morning he had, for reasons unrelated to you or me. Things went wrong quickly. He paused. Rode and Vey are in federal custody. The other two men rode out and I have warrants for them, but they are not your concern. He's really dead, she said. He is, Ethan said. She sat with that for a moment. She thought about the night in the hotel room in Caldwell, when she had stood over him with the gun and not been able to pull the trigger. And she thought about the years of watching Thomas fold himself smaller and smaller trying to survive in Parrish's orbit. And she thought about the weight of the fear she had been carrying for months like a stone in her chest. She thought about her mother's locket and her father's handwriting and the word carry. The warrant, she said, the one connected to the bank, is being reviewed by the federal judge in Topeka as of this week, he said. Given the evidence of coercion and Parrish's involvement in the original filing, it is my expectation that it will be invalidated within the month. She looked at him. You are a very unusual Marshal, she said. Something moved in his expression, something almost amused but more careful than amusement. I've been told that, he said. She stood up, because she needed to not be sitting in that chair anymore, and she walked to the window of the small office and looked out at the street of Harlan, Kansas, which was dusty and quiet and entirely ordinary, and she thought about St. Louis and Thomas and Nebraska, and all the directions a person's life could go if the right or wrong thing happened at the right or wrong moment. My brother, she said, is he safe? I sent a telegraph to the Marshal's office in Lincoln 3 days ago, Ethan said. They checked. Thomas Alcott is on a farm outside a town called Beatrice, Nebraska, and by all accounts he is working hard and staying out of trouble. She had not expected that. She had not expected him to have done that without being asked, and the unexpected quality of it hit her somewhere soft and unguarded, and she had to press her fingertips against the window frame to steady herself. You checked on my brother, she said, her back still to him. He came up in the case file, he said. It seemed relevant to know where he was. She stood there for another moment, and then she turned around and looked at him directly. You have been doing a great number of things that go beyond what is required of you professionally, she said. He looked at her. Yes, he said, I have. The honesty of it, the simple and undefended honesty, was more disarming than anything he could have said that was more elaborate. Why, she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding something, the way people look when they are choosing between the easier answer and the true one. Because I read your file, he said, and I found your locket, and I wanted to know how someone who carries what others cannot bear ends up in the situation you are in, and the more I found out, the more I wanted you to be all right. He paused. That is not especially professional. I am aware of that. She looked at him for a long time. How long have you known that about yourself? She said. That you wanted me to be all right. Since Harper, he said. Since dinner. She thought about the lamplight and the locket on the table and the quiet way he had said, "He sounds like a good man." "I need to sit down again," she said. He did not say anything. She sat down in the chair again, not the one she had been in when she was tied, but the one across the desk, the one that felt different, and she held the locket in both hands and thought very carefully. "The warrant will be invalidated," she said. "I believe so, yes. And Parrish is dead." "Yes. And my brother is safe." "Yes. And you tracked me across 3 counties," she said, "to return my mother's locket, and to see if you were all right," he said. "Yes." She looked down at the locket and then back up at him, and she felt something happening in her chest that she could not entirely categorize, something that was made up of equal parts terror and relief, and something else, something that had no name she could easily reach, but that felt like the thing her father had been describing when he said she could carry what others cannot bear except in reverse, the sensation of setting something down. "I don't know what to do with you," she said honestly. "That seems fair," he said. "I'm not sure I know what to do with you either." "That's not reassuring," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." They sat across from each other in the Harlan sheriff's office for another hour, and outside the window the afternoon light was going golden and long the way it does in Kansas in October. And Deputy Hicks brought them both coffee without being asked, and then withdrew again with commendable discretion. Margaret asked him about the case. Not just her part of it, but all of it. The 14 months of work he had been doing on Parrish. And he told her in detail that was not required by the conversation, but that she had asked for, and so he provided. Because that was apparently how he operated. And she found that she appreciated it profoundly. The sense of being given information as an adult who could handle it, rather than managed like someone who needed to be protected from the facts. She told him things in return. She told him about St. Louis and the debt her father had left, and the difficult years after his death. About learning to sew to bring in money, and about teaching herself to navigate systems and offices and official processes on behalf of her brother. Because Thomas had never been good at that kind of thing, and someone had to be. She told him about the particular education of watching someone like Parrish operate, of learning the specific vocabulary of intimidation and coercion, and how it was designed to look like opportunity on the outside, and only revealed its true structure from within. He listened the way she had noticed he listened to everything, with his full attention and without impatience, and she thought about how rare that was, not the attention exactly, because some men were attentive, but the lack of impatience, the sense that he had time for what she was saying and that it mattered to him. "What will you do now?" he said when she had been quiet for a while. She thought about it honestly. "I don't know," she said. "I was planning to go to Arkansas, but that plan was built around the assumption that I needed to keep running." "You don't have to run anymore," he said. She turned the locket over in her hands. "I know that intellectually," she said, "but the habit is recent enough that it's still there." "What was in Arkansas?" he said. "An idea," she said. "The vague sense of somewhere nobody knew me. You could go back to St. Louis," he said. "I could," she said. "But St. Louis is where Parrish's men know to find me, or where they would have known. Now that he's dead, I suppose that changes." "It does," he said. She looked at him across the desk. "And what will you do," she said, "after the case is formally closed?" "Go back to Wichita," he said. "File the paperwork, move on to the next thing." "The next case," she said. "Yes," he said, and there was something in the yes that was not quite satisfied, something that had a question at its edge. She noticed it. She was very good at noticing things. "You don't sound entirely certain of that," she said. He looked at her, and she saw him make that decision again, the one between the easier answer and the true one. "Wichita is a fine place," he said. But I've been there 6 years and I've spent most of them on the road, which tells you something about how much of a home it is. Where would you want to be? She said, and then felt the question was too personal and added, if not Wichita. He was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere that feels like it belongs to me, he said. I haven't found that yet. She looked at him and thought about the sensation she'd had earlier of setting something down. I understand that, she said quietly. They ate dinner together that night at the Harlan Hotel, in a dining room that was somewhat larger and more populated than the one in Harper. And the conversation was different from the first time, looser and warmer, because the formal stakes had changed. The rope was gone from her wrists, and the warrant was being reviewed, and Parrish was dead and her brother was safe. And all of those things together created a kind of space around the evening that she had not had in months. She told him about her mother. She had not planned to, but the locket was in her hand when he asked about the engraving again, and she found herself talking about Clara Alcott with an ease that surprised her, the way she had held herself, and the smell of her and the specific quality of her laugh. She talked about her father, too, about his patience and his habit of explaining how things worked, watches and compasses and the orbits of planets, and about the way his grief after her mother's death had never hardened into bitterness, but had stayed soft and present right up until the end. Ethan listened, and at some point, without her noticing the shift, he was no longer just listening but talking too, telling her about his own father in Jefferson City, about a man with very careful hands who believed that the most important thing you could do for a broken thing was understand exactly how it was supposed to work before you tried to fix it. He told her that he had been engaged once at 22 to a woman named Catherine, and that Catherine had eventually told him, with perfect kindness, that she needed someone who came home, and that she had not been wrong. He told her that he had not been angry about it, which was the part he still thought about sometimes, because the absence of anger had told him something about himself that had taken him a while to understand. "What did it tell you?" she said. "That I was already married to the work," he said. "And that wasn't Catherine's fault." He paused. "The work mattered. It still does, but I'm beginning to think that it isn't sufficient." She looked at him across the table and thought about how long it had been since she had been in a conversation that felt real in this particular way, the way that real meant two people being genuinely themselves without performance or armor. "It isn't sufficient," she agreed. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said what was in the air between them, because it was the first night of a new situation, and they were both people who were careful with important things. But it was there. It was very definitely there. The next morning she went to the telegraph office and sent a message to Thomas in Nebraska, telling him briefly that the situation had resolved, and that he was safe, and that she would write him a proper letter soon. She did not tell him about Parrish being dead, because that was a fact that required more careful handling than a telegraph. She told him she was well, which was true in a way it had not been true for a long time. Ethan spent the morning at the sheriff's office filing the formal paperwork that documented his pursuit, and the circumstances of her detention, and the evidence he had gathered against Parrish over the preceding months, all of which would need to go to Topeka. He worked methodically and thoroughly, the way she had already come to understand he did everything. And Deputy Hicks, who had been observing the situation with the dedicated attention of a young man who was learning something he couldn't quite name, helped him organize the documents with admirable efficiency. They ate lunch together at the general store's back counter, which served bread and cold beef and remarkably good coffee. And the ease between them was greater than it had been the night before, because one night of real conversation changes the landscape significantly. "I'd like to ride to Wichita," Ethan said over the coffee. "To file everything in person," she said. "Yes," he said, "and also because I think it would be useful for you to speak to the federal judge's representatives directly about the circumstances of the robbery, about Parrish." He paused. "It would strengthen the case for invalidating the warrant, and it would put your account on the official record, which would protect you going forward." She thought about it. "Wichita," she said. "Wichita," he confirmed. "You want me to ride back to the city I was running from," she said. "The thing you were running from is no longer there," he said, "and you would not be going alone." She looked at him. "Would be a 4-day ride," he said, "or 2 days by train if we take the stage to the junction at Pratt." He paused. "Either way, I'd be with you." She thought about the stage and the train and Wichita and official records, and the warmth of knowing that someone was with her who understood the full picture of the situation, and she thought about what it meant that he was offering to be that person. "All right," she said. They left Harlan the next morning. They took the stage east to Pratt, and then the train north to Wichita, and the journey took 2 days, and they spent those 2 days in conversation that ranged across an enormous amount of territory. The way conversations do, when two people are newly discovering that the other person is interesting in a great number of directions. They talked about Kansas and Missouri, and what it meant to be from a place that was always in between, geographically and historically, neither fully one thing nor another. They talked about the law, not abstractly but specifically, about the cases that had stayed with him and why, about the places where the written law and actual justice diverged, and what a person was supposed to do when they were employed to enforce one and committed to the other. She had more to say on this topic than he expected, because she had seen the system from a perspective he had not, from the outside and the underside of it, and he listened to her with the specific attention he gave to things that were changing how he understood something. She told him, somewhere in the second day with the Kansas planes moving past the train window, about standing in Parrish's hotel room in Caldwell with the gun. She had not meant to tell him. It came out in the middle of a longer conversation about choices made under duress, and once it was out she could not take it back, and she watched his face carefully. He did not look shocked. He did not look judgmental. He looked, if anything, like a man who was sorting something very carefully. "You couldn't do it," he said. "No," she said. "What stopped you?" he said. "If you don't mind me asking." She thought about it honestly. "I don't know exactly," she said. "Part of it was practical. I didn't know what the sound of the shot would bring down on me. Part of it was something else." She paused. "I think I was afraid of who I would become if I did it." "That's a significant thing to know about yourself," he said. "It felt like weakness at the time," she said. "It wasn't," he said. She looked at him. "You sound certain of that." "I am," he said. "A person who worries about who they'll become is a person who still has somewhere worth going." He paused. "That's not weakness. That's a moral compass working correctly." She looked out the window for a moment. "You are going to make it very difficult for me to maintain a reasonable level of distrust toward lawmen," she said. He looked at her, and for the first time the careful expression gave way to something that was genuinely warm, and she thought that the warmth of it suited him considerably better than the careful version, and that she would like to be the reason it appeared again. Wichita in late October was busier and louder than she had expected to find it in her current state, because she had been living at the scale of small Kansas towns for months, and the city felt suddenly large. But Ethan moved through it with the ease of someone who knew exactly where he was going, and she stayed close to him, and found that his certainty was oddly settling, like walking beside a landmark. They went first to the federal marshal's office, where Ethan's colleagues greeted him with the slightly reserved warmth that men give each other after long separations in dangerous occupations, and where Margaret was introduced simply as a material witness to the Parrish case, which was technically true and carefully chosen. Marshal Donovan, who was a broad man in his mid-40s with a face like weathered leather and eyes that were considerably sharper than his relaxed posture suggested, looked at her with the kind of assessment that she had learned to neither flinch from nor challenge, and then looked at Ethan with an expression that said several things that neither of them acknowledged. The next morning she gave a formal statement to the federal judge's representatives, a process that took 3 hours and was conducted by a lawyer named Hargrove, who was methodical and professional, and who asked her the same questions from multiple angles in the way that people do when they are testing for consistency. She answered consistently, because she was telling the truth, and by the end of it, Hargrove had told her that in his judgment the warrant would be invalidated, and that she was free to remain in Wichita pending that formal decision. She had stood on the steps of the federal courthouse after that conversation, and felt the Kansas wind on her face and thought about freedom in a way that was different from how she had thought about it for the past several months. Not freedom as the absence of pursuit, but freedom as a condition, as something that belonged to her as a given rather than something she had to outrun and outwit on a daily basis. Ethan came to find her after he had finished filing his own paperwork, and she was still on the courthouse steps, and he sat down beside her on the stone steps without ceremony and looked out at the street. "How are you?" he said. "Strange," she said. "Good strange, but strange." "The warrant will be invalidated by the end of the week," he said. "Hargrove told me." "He told me the same," she said. "It's real, isn't it? It's actually over." "It is," he said. She thought about real for a moment, and then she said, "What happens to you now, professionally?" "There will be commendations for the parish case," he said, with a tone that suggested he found this somewhat secondary to other concerns. "And an assignment review, likely. They'll want me in Wichita for a while before they put me back out on the road." "How do you feel about that?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I think I'm ready for a period of staying still," he said. She looked at him sideways, and he was looking at the street, and his profile against the afternoon sky was angular and composed, and she found herself looking at it for longer than was strictly necessary. "Where are you staying?" he said. "The Drover's Inn," she said. "On 3rd Street. I came through Wichita before and I remember it was clean." "It is," he said. "I'll walk you there." They walked through Wichita in the late afternoon, and the conversation was easy and warm, and at the door of the Drover's Inn he stopped and turned to look at her, and she looked back at him, and the question that had been forming between them for 4 days was suddenly very present and very clear. "Have dinner with me," he said, "tonight, not as a marshal and a material witness." She looked at him. "What then?" she said. "As a person who would like to have dinner with you," he said, "in whatever category that is." She felt the locket in her pocket, warm from the afternoon sun. "Yes," she said, "all right." He came for her at 7 o'clock, and they walked to a restaurant on Main Street that was considerably more elaborate than any of the hotel dining rooms and boarding house counters they had eaten at over the past week, and she had taken some care with her appearance in a way that she acknowledged to herself was deliberate, and decided not to be embarrassed about. He noticed. She could tell that he noticed, and he did not make a production of it, but something in his expression when he saw her was warm in a way that had a direction to it, and she found that she did not mind being seen in the way that he was seeing her. They talked differently that night. The framework of the case was gone, the last remaining formal distance between them, and what was left was just the two of them at a table with a good meal and genuine interest in each other. And the conversation moved quickly and easily between serious things and lighter things, and back again. He asked her, at some point during the meal, what she wanted. Not from the evening, but from the future, and he said it without any pressure or implication, just as someone who was genuinely curious what the answer was. She thought about it carefully, which was how she thought about important things. "I want to be somewhere stable," she said. "Somewhere I chose rather than somewhere I ended up. I want to do work that matters. I want to see my brother. I want to not be afraid." She paused. "I want things to feel like they belong to me." He looked at her when she said the last sentence with an expression of recognition, because those were almost exactly the words he had used 2 days ago about himself. "That's not so different from what I want," he said. "No," she said. "It isn't." They looked at each other across the table, and the lamplight was warm, and the room was full of the comfortable noise of other people's conversations. And she was aware that something was happening that had been happening slowly and inevitably since the moment the locket had hit the floor of the Harlan sheriff's office. And she thought that she could either continue to be careful about it, or she could simply acknowledge what was already true. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said on the train, about working out what something is supposed to be before you fix it." "That was my father's approach," he said. "Yes," she said, "but I think you apply it to everything." She paused. "Including people." He was very still and very attentive. "I've spent months in situations where everyone around me was trying to use me or control me," she said. "And then you arrived and you were different, and I kept waiting for it to stop being true, but it didn't, and I don't quite know what to do with that except to acknowledge it." "What are you acknowledging?" he said quietly. She looked at him across the table. "That I trust you," she said. "Which is remarkable, given everything, and that I would like to see what that means if you are willing to see it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I tracked you across 3 counties." "You did," she said. "I think that indicates I am willing to see it," he said. She felt something very warm and very clear settle into her chest, the opposite of the stone she had been carrying. "All right, then," she said. He walked her back to the drovers in that night, and at the door he took her hand briefly and held it. And the gesture was simple and entirely sincere. And she looked at their hands together and thought about her mother's locket and her father's engraving and the idea of carrying what others cannot bear. And she thought that there might be a corollary to that which had to do with letting someone else carry something alongside you. The weeks that followed were a revelation. The warrant was formally invalidated on a Friday morning, and Margaret sat in the federal office and read the document twice, and then set it down on the desk, and exhaled a breath she felt like she had been holding for 6 months. Ethan was across the room talking to Marshal Donovan, and he glanced at her over Donovan's shoulder and she nodded. And the look that passed between them across the width of that room was understood by at least 2 other people present, but went unremarked upon, because some things are too clear to require comment. She found work in Wichita. It was not difficult, because she was an excellent seamstress, and Wichita was a city that had more money coming through it than most places in Kansas. And within 2 weeks, she had more orders than she could easily fill. She rented a room in a respectable boarding house on Maple Street, and she bought a small work table and the proper tools. And she wrote Thomas a long letter telling him everything, including the parts about Parrish's death and the cleared warrant and the new situation in Wichita. Thomas wrote back within 10 days, which was faster than she had expected. And his letter was 3 pages of handwriting that was still recognizably her brother's, slightly too large and slightly uneven. But there was something in the tone of it that was older than the letters she had been receiving for the past few years, something that suggested the time on the farm had done him some good. He said he was glad about Parrish. He said he was sorry for what she had been through because of him. He said he wanted to meet the marshal who had crossed 3 counties for her locket, and that he already had opinions. She had laughed for the first time in a long time when she read that line. And then she had sat with the letter for a while and felt the specific texture of gratitude, which is related to relief, but not identical to it. Ethan took her riding on a Saturday morning in early November, out through the tallgrass prairie west of Wichita, where the autumn had turned the grass copper and gold, and the sky was the deep particular blue that it only reaches in late fall. He rode well, without the performance that some men brought to it, and she rode well too, and they moved through the landscape together at an easy pace and talked about things that had nothing to do with cases or warrants or the past 6 months. He told her about the river valleys in Missouri in autumn, about the color of maple trees and the sound of water over limestone, and she told him about the garden her mother had kept behind the house in St. Louis, the roses that came back every spring without being asked. They talked about books, about what they had read and what had stayed with them, and she discovered that he had read broadly and thought carefully about what he read. And this was not a surprise exactly, but it was a pleasure. At one point, they stopped on a rise that looked out across a long stretch of grassland, and the wind was cold and steady, and the sun was warm enough to balance it. And she sat on her horse beside him and thought about how thoroughly different this felt from everything that had preceded it. "I'm going to apply for a posting here," he said, "in Wichita, stationary rather than circuit work." She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon with the expression that she had come to recognize as the one he wore when he had already decided something and was simply telling her about it. "Because of the parish case," she said carefully. "Partly," he said, "and because of other things." She looked at the horizon too, at the long flat line of it. "I'm going to stay," she said, "in Wichita at least for a while." "I know," he said. "How do you know?" she said. "Because you rented a work table," he said. "A person who is still running doesn't buy a work table." She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her, and she thought about how much she liked being understood by him, genuinely understood, without having to explain every piece of the picture. "You pay close attention," she said. "I do," he said, "especially to you." She looked at him for a moment, and the wind was in his hair and the sun was on his face, and she thought that she had lost her locket at the Wichita train station, and it had led to this, and that her father had been right about her capacity for carrying things, but that sometimes the carried thing was not a burden but a treasure. "I'm glad you came after me," she said. "So am I," he said. They rode back to Wichita in the late afternoon, and that evening they walked along the Arkansas River and talked until the stars came out, and he told her that he had never in his life found someone so easy to be honest with, and she said the same, and neither of them pretended not to understand what they were saying to each other. He kissed her the next evening, standing on the steps of her boarding house, with enough deliberateness to make clear it was a considered act and enough warmth to make clear it was not only a considered act. She kissed him back, and her hands were against his coat and his were on her face, and the moment was quiet and certain and entirely itself. Winter came to Wichita, and with it a kind of settled reality that Margaret had not experienced for years. She worked steadily through November and December, building a small clientele of women who returned regularly and who brought their friends, and her reputation as a careful and skilled seamstress grew faster than she had expected, because she had learned long ago that doing a thing well and consistently was the most effective form of advertisement. She rented a better space in January, a small front room on Market Street that could serve as both a shop and a workroom, and she painted the window glass with her name in careful letters. M. Alcott, Dressmaking and Alterations. Ethan's posting was confirmed in December. He was assigned as a stationary federal marshal in Wichita with oversight of the surrounding territories, which meant that he still rode out on cases, but returned to the city on a regular basis, rather than spending months on the circuit. It was, he told her over dinner, the first time in 6 years that the word home had a fixed address. "Does it feel different?" she asked. "Remarkably," he said, and he was looking at her when he said it. Thomas came to Wichita in February. He arrived on the Tuesday train with a new coat and the air of someone who had been sober and working for long enough that it showed in his posture. And Margaret met him at the station and held him for a long moment, which was something they had not done since before their father died. She watched Thomas and Ethan meet each other with the particular alertness of someone who cares very much about how two important people in their life will regard each other. And she was cautiously pleased to discover that within an hour they were talking easily. And within 3 hours, they were in an extended conversation about the mechanics of saddle design that she had no interest in, but which made her deeply relieved. Thomas stayed a week. On his last evening, when Ethan had gone to get more firewood, Thomas sat across from her at the small table in her apartment and looked at her the way younger brothers look at older sisters when they are trying to say something that they are not entirely comfortable saying. "He looks at you like you're the fixed point," Thomas said. She thought about that. "Yes," she said, "he does." "Is that good?" Thomas said. "Yes," she said, "I think so." Thomas looked down at his coffee cup. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it. For the way I got tangled up with Parrish and what it cost you." She leaned across the table and took his hand. "You were 20 years old," she said, "and you were trying to find a way through, and you got lost, and we found each other again." She squeezed his hand. "That's the whole story." He looked up at her with her father's eyes. "Papa would have liked him," Thomas said. She smiled. "I know," she said. Spring came to Wichita the way it always comes to Kansas, suddenly and with force. And in April the prairie turned green again and the wind carried warmth in it instead of cold. And the city felt new in the way that cities feel new in spring when the worst of the year is behind them. Ethan proposed to her on a Sunday morning in the middle of April, in the kitchen of her apartment above the shop, with the coffee still brewing and her hair not yet pinned, and the sunlight coming through the east window at a low angle that made everything look deliberate and chosen. He sat across from her at the small kitchen table and he said, "I want to ask you something important, and I want to ask it now, when everything is ordinary and nothing is formal, because I think the ordinary version of things is the one that matters." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since Harper, since the lamplight and the locket and the way you answered every question I asked you with exactly as much truth as I had earned, no more and no less. I want to marry you. I want us to have a home that belongs to both of us. I want to be the person who comes home to you, and I want you to be the person I come home to." She set down her coffee cup. "I love you too," she said. "I've known it since the train, since you said that the work wasn't sufficient and you looked like you had just understood something important." "Is that a yes?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Of course it is." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring that was simple and silver with a small dark stone, and she looked at it and thought about silver things and what they meant and held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it for a moment. And then she looked at him across the small table with the morning light between them. And she thought that her father had been right about carrying, but that he had also been right about something he used to say without saying it directly, which was that the things you carry the longest are the ones worth keeping. They were married in June, in a small church on the east side of Wichita, with Thomas standing up with Ethan, and a woman from the seamstress guild named Ruth standing with Margaret, and Marshal Donovan in the front pew, looking quietly pleased with himself in the way that people do when something they suspected would happen has happened. The ceremony was in the morning, and the day was warm and clear, and afterward they ate at the hotel restaurant where they had gone on their first real dinner together, which Margaret had suggested, and which Ethan had agreed to immediately. She wore her mother's locket at the wedding. The chain had been replaced, the silver carefully repaired by a jeweler on 2nd Street who had told her it would last another 30 years at least. She wore it against the white of her dress and felt the weight of it, the good familiar weight of something that belonged to her and had always belonged to her and could not be taken away. That night, in the room at the hotel that looked out over the same street they had walked on the evening of their first real dinner, she sat at the small vanity and unpinned her hair and looked at her own face in the mirror. And she thought about the woman who had been walking fast through Wichita 6 months ago with her arm pressed close to her side and fear in her chest, and about the distance between that woman and this moment. Ethan came up behind her and met her eyes in the mirror, and his hands were on her shoulders and his expression was warm and entirely his own, the not careful version that she had been the reason for since November. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That I'm glad I lost the locket," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed, a real laugh, and she turned around on the stool to look at him because she had decided several months ago that his laugh was one of her favorite things. "I suppose in a technical sense," he said, "the locket is the reason for all of this." "In a technical sense," she agreed. He sat down beside her on the small, upholstered bench at the foot of the bed and took her hand, and she leaned against his shoulder, and the room was quiet around them, and the city was going about its ordinary business outside the window, and she felt the particular luxury of having nowhere to be except here. "Thomas said something before he went back to Nebraska," Ethan said. "He told me," she said. "He said you look at me like I'm the fixed point." "He said that to you too," Ethan said. "Is he right?" she said. "Yes," Ethan said simply. "He is." She turned her head to look at him. "I have a fixed point too," she said. "I've had one since Harlan." He looked at her with the warm and steady expression she had come to understand was his face when he was entirely himself, and he kissed her temple and her cheek, and she closed her eyes and thought about her father's engraving and what it meant to carry things and what it meant to set them down. Life settled into itself around them in the way that life does when two careful and serious people decide to build something together with intention. Ethan's work kept him in Wichita for the most part, with periodic rides out into the surrounding territories for cases that required a federal presence. And each time he left and came back there was a quality to the coming home that neither of them took for granted, because they were both people who understood what the alternative felt like. Margot's shop grew steadily through the summer and into the fall, and by October she had taken on a young woman named Pearl as an assistant, and the shop on Market Street had developed a genuine reputation not just for quality, but for the specific quality of working with women who needed help rather than just service, which was a distinction that Pearl had noticed and appreciated, and which was not accidental. There were a great many women in Wichita in 1883 who needed help rather than just service. Women who had come west with husbands and found themselves alone through various means. Women who were working for wages that assumed they should not need to live on them. Women who had run, like she had, for various reasons and in various directions, and who were trying to build something sustainable from what they had left. Margot did not have a plan when she started it, but over the course of that year, she found herself serving tea to women who needed someone to listen before they needed a dress altered, and offering connections and information alongside the needlework, and writing the occasional letter on behalf of someone who could not write well or whose handwriting was too recognizable to use. She told Ethan about it one evening in October, not as a confession but as an account, describing what it had become and what she thought it could be, and he listened the way he always listened, and then was quiet for a thoughtful moment. "You're running a small informal refuge," he said. "I suppose I am," she said. "That's a good thing," he said. "An important thing," He paused. Is there anything you need from me to make it work better? She thought about it. Knowledge of what the formal options are, she said. Sometimes there are legal avenues I don't know how to access. I'll write you a list, he said, and I'll introduce you to Judge Hartley's clerk. She is a very useful person to know. She looked at him. You are a very useful person to be married to, she said. I'm trying to be, he said, and the warmth in it was genuine and a little amused, and she reached across the table and took his hand. By the time their first anniversary came around, Margaret was expecting their first child, a fact she had discovered in March, and told Ethan on a Tuesday evening when he came home from the office to find dinner already on the table, and a look on her face that he read with his characteristic accuracy within 30 seconds of walking through the door. He had stood very still for a moment after she told him, and then he had come around the table and held her in a way that was both careful and strong, and she had felt his breath against her hair and the quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of someone who does not feel things but the stillness of someone who feels them very completely and needs a moment to contain them properly. Are you afraid? He said very quietly. A little, she said. Are you? A little, he said. Also something quite different from afraid. Yes, she said. That too. Thomas came for the summer, and he and Ethan got the small second room of their house properly set up with a good crib and a solid chest of drawers. And Margaret watched them work together with the tools and the lumber, and thought about her father's careful hands and about transmission, about how things pass from person to person across time. Their son was born in November, which seemed appropriate to Margaret, given that everything important in her life had happened in November or adjacent to it. He was born on a Thursday morning when the first real snow of the season was coming down outside the window, large and slow flakes that made no sound, and he was healthy and loud and entirely himself from the first moment. They named him William, after her father. She lay in the bed with William in her arms and Ethan sitting beside her, his hand over hers, and the snow was still falling outside and the room was warm, and the sound of the baby was the most complete sound she had ever heard. William Aldridge, Ethan said, trying the name out in the room. William Alcott Aldridge, she said. He should have both. Ethan looked at her. Yes, he said, he should. Thomas came to see his nephew the following week, and held him with the slightly terrified expression of a young man who has not held many babies. And William looked up at his uncle with the unfocused but intent gaze of a person who is very new to the world, and is assessing everything with equal thoroughness. He looks like he's already thinking about something important, Thomas said. He gets that from both sides, Margaret said. Ethan laughed from the doorway. William grew, in the way that children grow when they are well loved and well cared for, steadily and with great determination. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's thoughtful stillness, and very early on, the particular quality that Margaret recognized from her own childhood as the instinct for carrying things without letting them weigh you down. She kept the locket in the small wooden box on her dresser now, alongside the ring her father had worn, and a miniature photograph of her mother taken years before her death. She did not wear it every day as she once had, not because it mattered less, but because it was safe in a way it had not been safe for a long time. And she had learned the difference between carrying something because you are afraid to set it down and keeping something because it belongs to you and always will. On a Sunday morning in the spring of 1885, when William was 16 months old and walking everywhere with great confidence and no particular concern for obstacles, Margaret found Ethan in the kitchen reading the letters that had come in the previous day's mail. She poured herself coffee and sat across from him and looked at his face, which was the face she knew better than any face in the world, the careful and warm face that had been her fixed point for nearly 3 years. "What is it?" she said. he looked up at her. "Letter from Thomas," he said. "He's engaged." She stared. "To who?" "A young woman from Beatrice named Clara," he said. "He says she works at the school and she is very sensible and has strong opinions about most things, and he finds this remarkable." Margaret set down her coffee cup. "He named her Clara," she said. "The young woman's name happens to be Clara," Ethan said. "He did not name her." "I know," Margaret said, and she felt something move in her chest that was warm and tender and slightly undone. "My mother's name was Clara." Ethan looked at her across the table with the expression that she loved best, the one that was full of understanding without requiring explanation. "He'll be happy," Ethan said. "Yes," she said. "I think he will." William appeared in the doorway of the kitchen at that moment, having escaped from wherever she had left him with a small wooden horse that Ethan had carved for him during the winter, and he toddled toward his mother with the unstoppable confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt his welcome. And she picked him up and settled him on her knee and held him against her chest. He grabbed at the collar of her dress with small, sure fingers and looked up at her with his father's eyes, and she held him and thought about what she had carried, and what she had set down, and what she had found in the setting down. And she thought that her father had been wiser than she had understood when she was young enough to think wisdom was the same as knowledge. Later that afternoon, after William was asleep and the Sunday quiet had settled over the house on Maple Street, she brought the locket downstairs and sat at the kitchen table with it in her hands, and Ethan sat across from her and watched her turn it over. She opened it for the first time in months. Inside was a small portrait of her mother, a miniature watercolor done by a street artist when her mother was perhaps 30, younger than Margaret was now, with her dark hair and her steady expression, and the quality about her that had always made Margaret feel, even after 20 years, that the world was survivable. "She would have liked you," Margaret said. "I hope so," Ethan said. "She would have," Margaret said. "She valued honesty and patience, and she had no patience for performance." She turned the locket over to the engraving. "She said something like this to my father once about carrying. He never forgot it." Ethan reached across the table and traced the engraving with his finger, the careful script that had started everything. "Neither will you," he said. "No," she said. "Neither will I." She closed the locket and set it on the table between them. And outside the window, the Kansas spring was loud with birds, and the smell of grass, and the distant sound of the city going about its business. And inside the house, her son was sleeping and her husband was across the table, and everything that had led to this moment, the loss and the running and the 3 counties and the floor of the Harlan Sheriff's office, had assembled itself into this specific and irreplaceable life. She reached across the table and took Ethan's hand, and he turned his palm up and closed his fingers around hers, and they sat there in the Sunday afternoon while the light moved across the floor and William slept in the next room, and the locket rested between them, and neither of them needed to say anything at all. Thomas married Clara in August of that year, in Beatrice, Nebraska, in a ceremony that Margaret and Ethan attended by train with William, who was by then 18 months old and extremely interested in trains and in the other passengers, and in everything that existed in the world, which was already proving to be a large category. Clara was exactly what Thomas had described, sensible and direct with opinions that she held firmly and expressed clearly. And she looked at Thomas with an uncomplicated warmth that Margaret recognized, not just from her own experience, but from the memory of watching her parents look at each other when she was young enough to be watching, but old enough to understand what she was seeing. After the ceremony, standing in the churchyard in the late summer light with William on her hip and Ethan's hand at the small of her back, she watched her brother and his new wife standing together with the particular stillness of 2 people in a moment they want to inhabit fully, and she felt the whole span of the past 3 years like a landscape seen from a height, the geography of it visible and comprehensible in a way it had not been while she was moving through it. She thought about running and about being found. She thought about the specific mercy of being found by someone whose finding was an act of care rather than capture. She thought about how many women had run through that same landscape and had not been found in that way. And she thought about Pearl and the shop on Market Street, and the letters written on behalf of people whose handwriting was too recognizable to use. And she thought about the work that was still to be done, and about how having a fixed point made the work possible rather than impossible. William leaned his head against her shoulder and looked at the churchyard with his father's thoughtful eyes. "Good," he said, which was one of his current words. "Yes," she said, pressing her lips to the top of his head. "Very good." Ethan turned to look at her then, drawn by her voice, and she looked back at him with everything she felt entirely visible on her face, because she had learned over the past 3 years that showing him things directly was both easier and more honest than being careful about it. He looked at her with the warm and steady expression that was his whole self, the fixed point of him, and reached over to take William's small hand where it rested on her shoulder. "Ready to go home," he said. She thought about the house on Maple Street and the shop on Market Street, and the way Wichita looked in the early morning when the light came in from the east, and everything smelled like grass and coffee and the good ordinary smell of a life in progress. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." And so they went, the three of them, back toward the station and the train and the long flat horizon of Kansas in August. And the locket was in her pocket against her ribs, warm and certain, carrying what it had always carried, and the distance between where she had been and where she was felt at last, like exactly the right distance, the kind you can look back across without flinching, because it is the ground that brought you here, and here is where you chose to stand.